Hi, and welcome to our Lenten journey called CrossTalk. This year, as we move from Ash Wednesday to Easter, we'll be examining some passages from the Gospel of John. And before we get into the first of those stories, we need to talk a little bit about the Gospel of John. John's different from the other three Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are written more sort of historically or biographically, as you might imagine a biography to be. John's written for a different reason and a different purpose. He's not writing history. He's not writing biography. John's trying to answer the what of Jesus' life. What did it mean, rather than the how of it or the when of it. So John gives us stories that are theological. What does this tell us about God? And what does this tell us about Jesus? And what does this tell us about us as the ones who follow this Jesus? He sets that up in the first chapter of his gospel and spends the rest of the gospel trying to explain what it means to say that the Word became flesh and lived here in this neighborhood. Now, there are two things about John that we need to understand before we go further. One is, John is never what it seems to be on the surface. If you've ever been to the Holy Land or to an archaeological dig, maybe say in Jericho, you've seen that there are layers where civilizations have been, where a city was built, destroyed, another city built on top, destroyed, another city built on top. The Gospel of John works almost as theological archaeology. You get layers of meaning in every story. There's the surface layer where things seem to be operating here, but then there's a layer beneath that and a layer beneath that. And then there are the layers the church has added on in interpretation over the centuries since. So be careful with John not to assume that things are what they seem. The second thing about John that we need to understand is that John has a lot of conversations. People come to Jesus, they ask him questions. This gives Jesus the opportunity to give lengthy answers, explaining what he means about himself. And Jesus is more disclosive about his own understanding of himself as the Christ, as the Son of God in the Gospel of John, than he is in any of the others. This is an exciting journey because this is a very different kind of book. So we're going to be looking at a series of conversations now for the next 7 weeks. Conversations that Jesus has with people in this gospel to explain who he is and to help us understand something, as I've said, about who we are. The first conversation we're going to look at occurs in the first chapter. In John chapter 1, verses 43 through 50, Jesus has a conversation with Nathanael. We want your group to pause the video now and to find that text and to read it aloud. Okay, so here's the story. The first conversation actually begins with Philip. Jesus invites Philip to follow him, and this makes this a discipleship story. The invitation's simple. Jesus says, "Come and see." What's really interesting and instructive about that is the very first thing a disciple of Jesus does when they've met Jesus is go and invite someone else. Philip represents the church here, and the church's mission of inviting others into discipleship, the church's mission of sharing the good news that it has received. So Philip goes and finds his friend Nathanael. Now, Nathanael only appears here. There are in the Gospels a list of the 12 disciples. Nathanael appears in none of them. There are efforts later in the history of the church to equate Nathanael with Bartholomew, but that's not necessarily the case. Nathanael is just Nathanael, with a very interesting name. Nathanael's name means God has given. So Philip says to Nathanael, "We've met the one of whom Moses and the prophets have spoken." So the first thing we learn here in the second layer down is that Jesus is the fulfillment of something. He's the fulfillment of all that the Old Testament has promised and prophesied about the one who is to come. And Philip believes he's seen that in the face of Jesus. So he witnesses to Nathanael, "We've seen the fulfillment." And the first testimony of the church is met with resistance. Nathanael's response is, "Right, can anything good come out of Nazareth?" There's a layer beneath that for us as well, and that is that the church's witness will often be met with skepticism and doubt. It's not universally received on the first hearing. So Philip models after Jesus. He says to Nathanael, "Well, come and see." The layer beneath. The church doesn't need to find or invent new and creative ways to make this invitation. We just are invited to do what Jesus did himself, to invite people to come and see. We leave the rest of the work to Jesus. We don't need to convert people. We just need to bring people, leave the conversion to God. Nathanael comes along, he follows, he meets Jesus. Jesus says, I saw you under a fig tree. Nathanael's astonished by that. And Nathanael begins to accept Jesus for himself. There is this confession of faith. Here's the fascinating thing. Nathanael's confession is personal and direct. He believes in Jesus, not something about Jesus. He doesn't say, this is the King of Israel. He says to Jesus, you are the King of Israel. The faith of the church is a personal faith. We believe in a person, not in a creed, not in a doctrine, not in a dogma. We believe in a person. We believe in the person of Jesus. That's what Nathanael teaches us in this story. So Jesus then says this sort of strange thing in verse 50 that sounds like a rebuke. He says, you believe because I saw you under a fig tree. I'm here to tell you you're going to see greater things than this. It's not a rebuke. It's a promise. It's an understanding that Nathanael in this story is at the beginning of his faith journey, and that if he'll continue the journey along with Jesus, he'll see even more than he's already seen. Jesus reveals something of himself to Nathanael. Interestingly enough, actually, here at the end of chapter 1, a chapter full of discipleship stories, Jesus reveals more of himself to the one who was a skeptic than he does to those who came to faith easily. Jesus identifies himself as the Son of Man. It's an enigmatic apocalyptic image from the book of Daniel, this Son of Man who will come at the end of the age to rule with God's power and God's might. And then he says, and you'll see angels descending and ascending from heaven on the Son of Man. Now, because you know your Bible well enough, you remember that that's the story of Jacob's ladder, the angels ascending and descending up and down when Jacob has this dream. What Jesus is saying here to Nathanael, the layer of meaning underneath for that is that he is now the bridge between heaven and earth. He, Jesus, on whom the angels ascend and descend, is now the ladder which reaches from earth to God and from God to earth. He's become the link, the critical link. So we begin with this first discipleship story, this story of Nathanael coming and moving from skepticism to confession, from doubt to faith, operating at levels beneath where we begin to see some things about the nature of the church and about who we are. We can understand who we are as disciples only by understanding who Jesus is. That's the point of this story. Until Nathanael understands that Jesus is the ladder between heaven and earth, he can't understand what it means to follow Jesus or to be a disciple of Jesus. So here are the questions. How has your faith journey moved from doubt to faith? And are there still places of doubt in your faith journey with which you're struggling and wrestling, which you need to bring to Jesus to receive some light? And what does it mean to understand yourself in the light of Jesus' understanding of himself? There are some people I'd like to introduce you to. You know, that's one of the first things they teach you in any kind of manners class or cotillion class, how to introduce people to each other. You have a friend and you say, may I introduce you to? There's some people I'd like to introduce you to. You'll recognize some of the names, and some of them will be unfamiliar to you. Names like Bob and Beth Frazier, Martha Bullock, or Bill Price, or Belton Joyner. I'd like to introduce you to some of the people who introduced me to Jesus. When I was younger, the things they said, the things they did, the way they lived, taught me something about who Jesus was so that I was intrigued enough to come and discover that for myself. We need people to introduce us to Jesus. We don't just stumble over him. It's not a natural thing for us to do. In the gospel lesson that we're looking at this week, Philip meets Jesus and immediately goes and finds his friend Nathanael and says, I'd like to introduce you to someone. We found the one who Moses and the prophets talked about. And when Nathanael protested because Jesus was from a backwater little town like Nazareth, Philip's response to that was, come and see for yourself. Somewhere in your past, somewhere in your history, somewhere in your faith journey, someone said to you, come and see for yourself, and you met Jesus. So the questions for this week are, Who introduced you to Jesus? And who needs you to introduce Jesus to them? The writer of Hebrews in the New Testament speaks of a great cloud of witnesses, pioneers in the faith who blaze the path ahead of us. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a cloud of witnesses, he writes, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely. The writer goes on to say that we're to look to Jesus as the pioneer and the perfecter of our faith. That's what we're doing in this third part of each session of CrossTalk. We're looking to Jesus through the lives of those who have followed him and who have desired that future generations do the same. This is an appropriate place for us to talk about pioneers in the faith. This log cabin, which was built in the 1930s as a part of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, during the Great Depression, reminds us of the great cloud of witnesses who are part of our heritage of faith here at First United Methodist Church. So let us begin with a pioneer who, after rejecting a life of wealth and privilege, embraced a much more humble life, a man whose faith has influenced countless millions who follow Christ. You know, invitations can be accepted, rejected, or ignored. They can also be resisted. Nathanael at first resists the call of Christ, as we've seen, but Jesus responds by inviting him to come and see. For the first 24 years of his life, Francis Bernardone also rejected the call to a life in Christ. Even though through his primary schooling, Francis learned to recite the Lord's Prayer, to say the Creed at Mass, and he memorized passages in Latin from the Psalms. As an adolescent and young man, no one would have ever guessed that he would one day become the great saint of Assisi. Young Francis had too much of a love of fine clothes and good times. He led the other young men of Assisi in enjoying good food and drink, singing and dancing. At the age of 20, Francis was eager to join his friends in glorious battle. So he joined a ragtag group from Assisi in their fight against Perugia, a nearby town in Italy. Early in the battle, he was taken prisoner and dragged off to a subterranean vault where he survived on meager leftovers and tainted water. Prison was a perfect incubator for all kinds of diseases, and we can only imagine the anxiety, suffering, and deprivation that Francis went through, a contrast to his earlier life of frivolity and luxury. After a year, truce was signed, and Francis' father paid the agreed-upon ransom for his son's release. Sobered by prison and chronic illness, Francis experienced several religious encounters. In one of those vividly amazing encounters down at the church by San Damiano, Francis was confronted by a crucifix, a painted cross in the style of the Eastern Orthodox icons, where the eyes of Christ gazed directly toward the viewer. And it was there he heard the tender and kind voice of Christ saying to him, "Francis, don't you see that my house is being destroyed? Go then and rebuild it for me." Francis took the challenge literally at first and went quickly back to the city, sold his horse and some cloth from his father's shop, and came back to give the money to the priest at San Damiano for the rebuilding of the church, which still stands today. That invitation from the Christ on the cross of the abandoned church of San Damiano marks the beginning of a lifelong process of conversion for Francis, the one who would later be called the reluctant saint. In an incandescent moment, his life was given purpose. He heard the voice of Christ, and his heart longed to respond and to continue the dialogue. This was Francis' first step in turning everything over to God. St. Francis later composed a prayer to remember that exchange and that moment, that experience. Most high, glorious God, enlighten the darkness of my heart and give me true faith, certain hope and perfect charity, sense and knowledge, Lord, that I may carry out your holy and true command. That's a meaningful prayer for us today as we ponder these questions. When did you first really hear and respond to Christ's invitation to you? In other words, what was the beginning of your lifelong process of conversion? And what was your first step in turning everything over to God?